My name is Harper Lane. I was 28 when this happened, living in a one-bedroom apartment in Austin, Texas, and halfway through a graduate program in intercultural communication. And that night, that night, I realized something that shook me to the core. Sometimes silence is more powerful than screaming. It was a warm Friday evening in May. I was sitting at a long mahogany dining table set with crystal glasses and expensive porcelain surrounded by people who smiled with their mouths but sliced with their words. On the surface, it looked like a scene from a high society dinner party, laughter echoing under a chandelier, the clinking of cutlery compliments about the wine. But underneath, it was war, and I was their unsuspecting target. Across from me, my boyfriend of 6 months, Lucas Herrera, grinned as he leaned toward his sister and whispered in Spanish, "Ella es bonita, pero no tiene cerebro." She's pretty, but she has no brain. I smiled back at him like I hadn't heard a thing. But I had. Because what Lucas and his family didn't know, what they never thought to ask, was that I'd spent 3 years working in Guatemala and had become fluent in Spanish long before I met him. I'd sat through the first 2 courses of this family dinner, silently collecting their insults like grenades. Soft, subtle phrases thrown across the table, jokes with me as the punchline, remarks laced with cultural superiority. They thought I didn't understand. They thought I was the dumb, blonde girlfriend, the one who would never catch on. And I let them believe it. I dipped my spoon into the soup, a rich homemade black bean consommé with a slice of avocado floating on top. "Delicious," I said in English as Lucas's mother gave me a tight-lipped smile and muttered in Spanish, "At least she eats like a lady, not like those American pigs." That one stung more than the rest, but I didn't flinch. Because here's the thing, I knew I had 2 options. I could explode right then and there, toss my napkin onto the table and storm out in tears, demanding an apology, demanding Lucas defend me. Or I could stay quiet and wait. Let them stack the offenses like a fragile house of cards, one cruel sentence at a time, until I was ready to blow the whole damn thing down with one sentence. And that's when I realized silence isn't submission. It's strategy. If you've ever sat in a room where people thought they were smarter than you, better than you, because they didn't know you were listening, then you know this feeling. The heat in your stomach, the rising pressure behind your eyes, the voice in your head screaming, "Don't cry, not here, not now." I'd been there before, but this time was different. This time I had a plan. Lucas reached under the table and placed his hand on my knee. Possessive, casual. Like I was an accessory, a display piece he was proud to show off but never quite respect. I swallowed hard and turned to him with the softest smile I could muster. "Thank you for bringing me tonight," I said sweetly. "Your family is so warm." He chuckled. "They are," he replied in English. "They're a little intense sometimes, but they mean well." They meant to humiliate me. If you've ever been underestimated, ignored, or quietly insulted by people who smiled to your face, let me know in the comments. Because this story, it's for us. If you've ever sat through a dinner like this, smiled through your rage, and counted the seconds until your moment came, drop a like and stay with me. Because you're about to watch how I flipped the entire table without raising my voice. It hadn't always been like this. When I met Lucas Herrera, I thought he was different. Thought he saw me. Not the polished surface, my degrees, my long blonde hair, my quick wit, but the layers underneath. It was a chilly morning at Clementine's Book Cafe, a corner spot I always escaped to after class. I had my laptop open, half-finished notes on post-colonial communication theories blinking on the screen, and a stale blueberry muffin I'd barely touched. That's when he appeared. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from me. The place was packed. I hesitated. He smiled, a slow, deliberate kind of smile that made it hard to say no. "I promise I'm quiet." That was a lie. He was never quiet. I nodded, and he slid into the chair, sipping a black Americano. "Lucas," he said, offering his hand. "Harper," I replied, feeling that instant electricity. We talked for hours. He was smart, smooth, and knew how to tell a story. Born in Miami, raised by Colombian parents, Lucas worked in finance, but claimed his true love was literature. He quoted Neruda and Allende in the same breath, then told me he read marketing reports just to pay the bills. I should have noticed the contradictions, but in that moment, they felt like complexity, not warning signs. He asked what I did, and when I told him I was studying intercultural communication, his eyes lit up. "That's rare," he said. "A woman who understands nuance." Most girls these days, they just parrot what they hear online. I remember laughing, flattered by the backhanded praise. I should have asked more questions. Which girls exactly? And why did he need to draw those lines between me and them? The first red flag came 2 weeks in. We were having dinner at my place. I made arroz con pollo, a dish I learned from a woman I'd lived with in Guatemala. Lucas took one bite, smiled, and said, "You're trying. It's cute." I remember the sting, but I waved it off. He said it with a grin, so it couldn't have been mean, right? Wrong. Looking back, it was always there. The subtle digs, the jokes about American girls and their obsession with therapy, the way he corrected my Spanish when I pretended to be bad at it, the way he laughed when I told him I'd never been to Colombia, then said, "That's okay. You'd get eaten alive anyway." There were moments of warmth, too, holding hands at the park, the time he brought me soup when I had the flu, the long talks where he shared how hard it was to please his father. Those were the memories I clung to when my gut screamed something else. You see, people like Lucas are good at the performance of love. They give just enough kindness to keep you guessing, just enough softness to confuse your instincts. And if you, like me, grew up believing that intelligence and charm made someone safe, then you might fall for it too. He met all my checkboxes on paper: bilingual, educated, successful. But checkboxes don't capture character, and maybe I didn't want to see it. I liked the way people looked at us, how we seemed to fit. He was dark and worldly. I was bright and ambitious. We looked like a couple you'd see in a travel ad or on a university brochure. Picture perfect. Until you zoomed in. That's how it goes, doesn't it? Sometimes we ignore the quiet erosion of dignity because the surface looks shiny enough. A month before the dinner, he made a comment that should have ended things. We were out with friends, and someone joked about cultural clashes in relationships. Lucas raised his glass and said, "Well, Harper's not like most American women. She listens." Everyone laughed, including me. But that night, alone in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought, why does that feel like a compliment and an insult at the same time? I brushed it off, like we all do, until I couldn't anymore. Because 6 months in, I was about to meet his family. And what I didn't realize was that this wasn't a warm welcome. It was an evaluation, a test I was never meant to pass. And if you've ever dated someone who praised you for being not like other women, just know it's not admiration. It's a setup. Because someday when you stop fitting their mold, you'll become the very thing they claim to hate. The night Lucas told me he wanted me to meet his family, I felt my chest tighten. Not with dread, not yet, but with a nervous anticipation. I thought it was a good sign. A milestone. I even remember texting Zoe, my best friend, a string of celebratory emojis, followed by, "It's happening. I'm meeting the Herreras next weekend." Her reply was immediate and brief. "You sure that's a good thing?" I ignored it. Zoe had always been protective, blunt, even harsh, but she didn't know Lucas the way I did. She hadn't seen the sweet version, the late-night calls, the texts that said "thinking of you," the forehead kisses when I was too tired to talk. She didn't understand how much progress we'd made, how real this was becoming. "Dinner will be casual," Lucas said, but his tone didn't match his words. "My mom can be traditional. My dad's a bit formal. Just smile and be polite. Camilla's a little intense, but she'll warm up." Camilla was his older sister. I'd heard her name before in scattered stories, always with that edge in Lucas's voice that made me think he admired her, feared her, and competed with her all at once. "She'll probably grill you," he added, brushing a hand down my arm. "She thinks no one's ever good enough for me." I laughed, then brushing off the weirdness. But part of me began to prepare. I spent the next few days in what I can only describe as emotional boot camp. I practiced basic Spanish greetings, scoured blogs for Colombian dinner etiquette, even researched traditional dishes so I wouldn't embarrass myself over the meal. I bought a conservative navy dress that felt just polished enough. Too much effort? Maybe. But I wanted to make a good impression for him. The night before the dinner, I sat on my couch, wine glass in hand, anxiety tapping like a drumbeat in my chest. Zoe was on speakerphone, her voice steady. "I'm not saying don't go," she said, "but I am saying, listen with your gut, not your ego." What's that supposed to mean? It means don't let compliments blind you if something feels off. Just observe. She'd said that same thing back in February after Lucas made a backhanded comment about my student loan debt at a dinner party. "He's just joking," I told her then. But the joke stayed with me. Now it echoed louder. Saturday came. Lucas picked me up in his black Mercedes, freshly washed, smelling like expensive leather and bergamot. He looked me over when I opened the door and said, "You look perfect. Very appropriate." I laughed. "Thanks, you look all right yourself." But the word appropriate lingered like an aftertaste. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't confident. It was passable. The Herreras lived in a gated neighborhood outside the city. As we pulled into their winding driveway, I felt like I was entering a world I didn't belong to. Pristine hedges, marble fountains, a 2-story stucco house with floor-to-ceiling windows. The kind of place where even the breeze felt like it had a resume. Lucas reached for my hand before we got out of the car. "Remember," he whispered, "just follow my lead." The front door opened before we even rang the bell. His mother stood there tall and composed with a tight bun and a tighter smile. She hugged me, kissed the air beside my cheek, and said in English so lovely to finally meet the American girl. Behind her was Mr. Herrera, steely-eyed and stoic, and then Camilla Sharp, stunning, with eyes that didn't blink. She looked me up and down like a project she hadn't approved of. "It's so nice to be here," I said with as much grace as I could summon. They led me inside. The house was a museum, immaculate, cold, and rich with things you weren't allowed to touch. Family portraits lined the walls. Religious icons framed the entryway. Not a speck of dust, not a magazine out of place. As Lucas gave me a brief tour, I caught moments. Exchanges between him and Camila that were too quick. The way his mother flinched when I complimented a painting. The pause before Mr. Herrera responded to my greeting. Something was off. But I smiled through it, because I thought maybe, just maybe, I was overthinking again. I wanted to believe this was normal awkwardness, first-time jitters, cultural differences. I didn't realize I was walking straight into a performance, and I wasn't cast as the guest. I was the punchline. And I was about to find out just how cruel an inside joke could be when you're the only one who doesn't laugh. If you've ever dressed up for someone who secretly hoped you'd fail their test, tell me in the comments. Because that's the night I stopped trying to belong and started preparing to expose. The dining room felt like a movie set. A chandelier hung from the ceiling like a crown, casting soft golden light over the polished mahogany table that stretched the length of the room. Each place setting had been arranged with obsessive precision, china plates rimmed in gold linen napkins, folded into origami shapes, crystal glasses that shimmered under the light. It was the kind of room where silence didn't feel empty. It felt controlled. Lucas's mother gestured to my seat with a manicured hand. "Here, dear. Sit next to Lucas, across from Camilla." Of course. I slid into the chair, smoothing the skirt of my navy dress, as Camilla's eyes scanned me like a customs officer searching for contraband. Her mouth curved into a smile, but it was all teeth, no warmth. The moment we sat down, the switch flipped. English disappeared from the table like it had never existed. Spanish filled the air fast and fluid, like a code I wasn't supposed to crack. But I did. I caught every word. Lucas handed his mother the bottle of wine we'd brought, a California red I'd chosen myself. "Es americano," she said with an audible sigh. "American, huh?" Lucas's father chuckled. "Figures." I sipped water instead of wine, smiled as if nothing had been said. "Gracias por invitarme a su casa," I said carefully, offering one of the few rehearsed lines I'd practiced in the mirror. A beat of silence, then soft laughter, suppressed but not subtle. Camilla leaned toward Lucas and muttered in Spanish, "She sounds like a tourist in Madrid." I kept my posture straight, my face calm. I would not flinch. The maid appeared with the first course ajiaco, a Colombian chicken and potato soup, rich and aromatic. It smelled like comfort. It tasted like contempt. "Delicioso," I said, offering another practiced compliment. Camila didn't wait. "Ella parece una chica de Instagram. She looks like an Instagram girl." Lucas laughed. Not the warm private chuckle I knew, but something colder, slicker. "Linda pero tonta. Pretty but dumb." His mother smiled into her napkin. His father didn't bother hiding his smirk. I twisted my napkin under the table, willing myself not to cry. Not yet. Hold it. Because if they thought I was stupid, if they thought I was just some clueless American trophy, then I was going to let them keep thinking that. For now. The second course arrived. Grilled fish over roasted vegetables. I nodded politely as I tasted it, keeping up appearances. Conversation flowed in Spanish. Lucas's family spoke freely now, comfortable, emboldened. They made jokes about my dress, my accent, my lack of refinement. Each comment was delivered like a paper cut, small, fast, but deeply wounding. At one point, Lucas's father looked straight at me and said in English, She's very blonde, isn't she, as if I were a piece of furniture. Lucas patted my hand. He's teasing, he said. Then in Spanish to his father, she's not as vacant as she looks. Another wave of laughter. I swallowed a mouthful of bitterness and wine. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to say I heard you. I understood every damn word, but not yet. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about showing them who I really was on my terms. Then came the worst moment. Lucas's father leaned back in his chair and asked in Spanish, "So is she the one?" Lucas didn't hesitate. "She's a good filler until I go back to Bogota." I stared at the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered patterns with my eyes trying to ground myself. I counted to 5, then 10, then 20. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply smiled so softly it was almost defiant. Because I had just decided I wouldn't expose them tonight. I'd do it in a way they'd never forget. Camilla glanced at my wine glass, then at me. I was on my second. She whispered something to her mother, who chuckled and said, "At least she knows when to stop." Surprising for an American. Lucas's hand slid back onto my knee under the table. I resisted the urge to push it away. Instead, I leaned in, gave him a look he couldn't quite read, and whispered, "I'm doing great. Your family's been enlightening." He smiled, thinking I was being sweet. But what I meant was, I see all of you now, and soon you'll see me. Have you ever smiled while someone tried to break you? Stayed calm even as they carved into your dignity? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes power isn't in the shouting, it's in the waiting. The night stretched on like a long, cruel joke that no one bothered to end. Each course came and went, exquisitely plated, perfectly timed, insult by insult, folded delicately between sips of wine and silver forks tapping china. When the dessert finally arrived, a golden flan that shimmered beneath the chandelier, I wasn't hungry anymore. I was calculating. Lucas's mother picked up her espresso cup and asked in English, "So Harper Lucas tells us you're in graduate school. What are you studying again?" "Intercultural communication," I said, grateful for a moment of my native tongue. She stirred her coffee slowly. "How practical." I smiled. "It's fascinating, really. I focus on how people from different backgrounds communicate and miscommunicate." Lucas chuckled beside me. "Harper's very into understanding people. It's cute." "Cute." Camilla leaned in. "So how did you two meet?" I told them the bookstore story, the meet cute, I used to replay like a favorite song. But as I spoke, I saw Lucas whisper something in Spanish to his sister. Her smirk widened. "Such a romantic," his mother said. "Don't you think, darling?" Mr. Herrera grunted. Lucas squeezed my shoulder. "She doesn't need romance," he said, his tone suddenly hard to pin down. "She's very accommodating." They all shared a knowing look, a silent laugh, one of those moments where you're in the room but not in on the joke. I smiled wider, because I had already stopped playing their game. I had written my own rules now. But before I could say anything more, Camilla placed her fork down, leaned forward, and asked, "So, Harper, how long exactly have you been with my brother?" 6 months, I answered, meeting her gaze without blinking. She turned to Lucas and said under her breath, "Demasiado tiempo, too long." Lucas gave a low chuckle and poured himself another glass of wine. He didn't defend me, not once that evening, and that's when I knew I wasn't just being mocked. I was being showcased, like a dog in a sweater at a country club, something amusing to show off before they put me back in my box. I looked around the room at the immaculate furniture, the curated decor, the family photos framed in gold, a fortress of wealth and image and tradition. And me, the outsider invited in for sport, not for love. And Lucas, he had played along, encouraged it, participated. But what none of them knew, what none of them ever expected, was that I hadn't just been listening. I'd been learning. Mapping the rhythms of their cruelty, translating their hierarchy, watching how they wielded language like a blade. That was the moment I decided I wasn't just going to leave. I was going to redefine the ending. And the timing had to be perfect. So when Lucas leaned close, breath warm against my neck, and whispered, "You doing okay?" I didn't flinch. I smiled and whispered back, "This has been eye-opening." He took it as a compliment, and that's how I knew I had him. I excused myself to the restroom, not because I needed a break, but because I needed a moment to breathe, to hold back the scream rising in my throat, to keep my strategy intact. As I stared into the gilded mirror above the marble sink, I repeated one line over and over in my mind. "You do not owe them kindness. You owe yourself truth." When I returned to the table, Camila was recounting some family gala story, and Lucas's mother was correcting her pronunciation of an English phrase. Mr. Herrera sat with one hand resting on a crystal tumbler, eyes scanning me like I was part of the wallpaper again. I took my seat. I picked up my spoon, and I smiled. Because they had no idea that their time was almost up. If you've ever held your composure in the face of humiliation, if you've ever smiled through venom just to buy yourself time, leave a comment below. And if you know the power of staying quiet just long enough to be heard on your own terms, don't forget to subscribe. Because this isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Dinner was winding down, but the tension only grew thicker. It clung to the room like the smoke from Mr. Herrera's after-meal cigar curling into corners impossible to ignore. Lucas sat taller now, more relaxed, convinced that I had passed their twisted little test. Camilla had grown quieter, but her eyes flicked toward me like she was still trying to figure out how much I actually understood. And Lucas's mother, well, she had settled into a smug serenity, the kind of look that says, "We did our job, we put her in her place." They were all wrong. I wasn't in a place they assigned. I was exactly where I needed to be. When the maid returned to clear the dessert plates, I looked up at her, really looked. She must have been no older than 25, maybe less. Her eyes never lifted her back, always straight, her Spanish responses clipped and quiet. I wondered how many evenings like this one she'd witnessed, how many outsiders she'd seen, chewed up by this family, and sent away politely bruised. As she collected my plate, I offered a gentle gracias. La comida fue excelente. She glanced at me, brief surprised. Then she nodded once and left. That small interaction, barely a breath, gave me more clarity than all the hours of Lucas's curated charm. It reminded me who I was before all this. Before him. Before I started shrinking myself into something digestible. And then Camilla struck one final time. As the coffee was poured and Lucas's father began going on about some charity gala they were sponsoring, Camila leaned toward her brother, not bothering to hide her voice, and said, "Como su alma, negra," black like her soul. Lucas snorted, stifling it behind a fake cough. I took a long sip of coffee, let the bitterness sting the back of my throat, and I smiled. Because that was it, the last one. I glanced at the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Family portraits lined it, Lucas as a child, Camilla in a graduation gown, the whole family on a yacht, all pristine and proud. And suddenly, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. They had built this life, this fortress of appearances, and they were terrified of anything they didn't control, including me. Lucas leaned close again, his breath sweet from dessert. "Let's go soon," he murmured. "You've been amazing tonight." I tilted my head. "You think so?" "Absolutely," he said, confident. "They love you." I laughed softly. "Yeah," I said. "I got that impression." Then his father turned to me and asked in English, "So what do you hope to do with your degree in—" what was it again? "Intercultural communication," I repeated, clear and direct. He raised one brow. "Ah yes, that field." I nodded. "I'm specializing in language perception and behavioral signaling across cultures. You'd be surprised how often people say one thing to your face, and something entirely different behind your back." The table went quiet. Lucas's hand tensed slightly on my leg beneath the tablecloth. His mother cleared her throat. How insightful. I turned to her with a soft smile. It's remarkable how much we give away when we think no one's listening. Lucas tried to steer the conversation away. "Mom, didn't you want to tell Harper about Cartagena?" She nodded, rattled but trying to recover. "Yes, our beach house. Lucas hasn't mentioned it." "No," I said, still smiling. "He hasn't." Camilla smirked and Lucas shot her a warning glance. But it was too late. The current had shifted. They were suddenly aware that I was not the girl they thought I was. Still, I wasn't ready to tip the scale completely. This wasn't the moment for fire. This was the moment for stillness. To let them wonder, to plant the seed. Let it take root. And I could see it now in Lucas's eyes, in the stiffness of his mother's spine, the way his father narrowed his gaze. They were questioning everything. They were running through the evening in reverse, searching for the cracks in their perfect script. They didn't know what I knew. And that was the power. If you've ever been underestimated by people who didn't know what you were capable of, tell me how you held your silence. Because silence is not absence. It's armor. And sometimes it's the beginning of the most honest kind of revenge. As we left the dining room and made our way toward the door, Lucas seemed visibly lighter, as though he'd just crossed a finish line. He draped his arm over my shoulder and whispered, "Told you they'd love you." I didn't answer, because I wasn't done yet. Lucas's mother pulled him aside in the foyer, speaking low in Spanish. I didn't need to hear every word to understand the tone displeasure wrapped in politeness. I caught fragments, not serious. "She's not permanent. Too American." His father stood near the door, swirling the last of his brandy, watching me the way one might watch a bird that accidentally flew into their house. As Lucas finished his whispered conversation, his father approached me. "You were quiet tonight," he said in English. I smiled. I was listening. There was a pause, a twitch in his jaw. "I imagine you were," he said slowly. Lucas returned, slipping his arm around my waist again, and we walked out into the night. The door closed behind us with a heavy click, but the weight didn't lift. Not for me. Inside the car, Lucas was beaming. "See, that went way better than expected." I stared out the window, watching the mansion shrink in the side mirror, swallowed by trees and darkness. "Did it?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He glanced at me. "Come on, they really liked you." I turned to face him. "Did they in English or in Spanish?" His grip on the wheel tightened. "What do you mean?" "I'm just curious," I said lightly. Because it felt like the English was for show. The Spanish was for each other. He forced a laugh. "You're overthinking, Harper. You always do that." Maybe I used to, but not tonight. We rode in silence for a while, headlights slicing through the quiet suburban streets. I thought about how many times I'd made excuses for him for them, how I'd let sarcasm pass as affection, how I'd ignored the tightening in my chest every time he made a comment that felt just a bit too sharp. When we pulled up to my apartment, Lucas reached across the console and took my hand. "Want to come in?" I asked. Relief washed over his face. "Yeah, of course." Inside, he made himself comfortable on the couch while I boiled water for tea. My apartment, small but warm, was filled with things I loved. Books stacked on mismatched shelves, postcards from cities I'd visited, the woven rug I bought from a street market in Oaxaca. Lucas had always treated it like a charming curiosity, not a home. "Tea okay?" I called out. "Perfect," he replied, already scrolling through his phone. A message pinged and he smiled. "Your sister?" I asked, leaning on the kitchen counter. "Yeah," he said. "She wants to know if you survived the Inquisition." "What did you tell her?" "That you were perfect," he said, still grinning. "The perfect American girlfriend." I walked over, setting the mugs down. Then I sat on the edge of the coffee table, directly across from him, close enough that our knees nearly touched. "Lucas," I said softly, "can I ask you something?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Of course, anything." "What does linda pero tonta mean?" His face paled instantly. I didn't stop. "How about demasiado tiempo or negra como su alma? Or my personal favorite, she's just a good filler until I go back to Bogota." The silence between us swelled deafening. The water boiled over in the kitchen. I didn't move. Lucas blinked, his voice barely a whisper. "You speak Spanish." I leaned back slowly, fluently, since I was 19. He stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked up at him. "Why didn't you tell me you brought me there to be mocked?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You and your family dissected me like I was a specimen," I said. "You talked about me as if I wasn't a real person sitting 2 feet away. You laughed at me to my face in a language you thought I couldn't understand." It wasn't like that he tried. It was exactly like that. If you've ever discovered the truth not through confrontation but through quiet observation, drop a comment. Because this was the moment I stopped being the good guest and started becoming the narrator of my own story. And if this moment hit you hard, if you've ever smiled while someone underestimated you, don't just watch. Subscribe. Because sometimes the best revenge starts with fluency. Lucas stood frozen in my living room, arms slack at his sides, mouth parted as if still searching for a script he hadn't rehearsed. The master manipulator, charming, composed, always one step ahead, had finally run out of lines. I didn't move. I wanted him to sit in the silence, to feel what it was like to be exposed, without raising a voice, without making a scene. Just facts. Just truth. "I can explain," he muttered, finally breaking the stillness. "They were teasing. That's just how my family is." I raised an eyebrow. "And when you said I was just a filler until you went back to Bogota, was that a joke too?" He winced. "That came out wrong." "No," I said quietly. "It came out exactly how you meant it. You didn't know I understood. That's the only reason you said it." He looked away, running his hand through his hair for the 3rd time. "Okay, yes, some of what was said was harsh. But Harper, it's just cultural. Latin families are—" I cut him off. "Don't you dare hide behind culture. I've lived in Latin America. I know what respect looks like in every language." His shoulders dropped. "You're blowing this out of proportion." There it was. That phrase, that tone. That subtle attempt to recast my fury as hysteria, my pain as exaggeration. I stood now. I sat through 3 hours of cruelty. I listened to your sister call me cheap. Your mother belittle my intelligence. Your father treat me like a temporary hobby. And you, my voice cracked, but I steadied it, you laughed along. You never once stood up for me. Lucas walked toward me slowly, reaching for my hand. I made a mistake. I pulled back. You made a choice. He stared at me, speechless again. You chose to parade me around like a trophy. You chose to let your family reduce me to a stereotype. And worst of all, you chose to believe I wouldn't notice because you never thought I could. The tears stung the corners of my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Not for him. Harper, he pleaded, don't do this. We can fix it. I'll talk to them. I'll explain. I shook my head. It's not about them. It's about you. You brought me into that lion's den not as a partner, but as a performance. Something shiny to earn you applause. But you didn't count on me understanding the lines backstage. He sat down on the sofa like someone had taken the wind out of his chest. I didn't expect you to. To be fluent, I finished. To be aware, to be more than your exotic accessory. He dropped his gaze. And suddenly I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt release. I walked to the door, opened it, and held it wide. We're done, Lucas. He stood stunned. You're seriously ending this just like that? I tilted my head. Just like that, Lucas. You ended it when you opened your mouth in Spanish and thought I couldn't hear. He didn't move. His silence now was different. It wasn't calculated or condescending. It was terrified. I didn't mean to hurt you, he whispered. No, I said. You meant to get away with it. He took a step forward. We had something, Harper. Don't throw it away. I'm not, I said. I'm reclaiming what you tried to throw away, my dignity. He lingered there as if waiting for me to change my mind. But I didn't. And when he finally walked out, I closed the door behind him without looking back. Then I locked it. If you've ever shut a door on someone who thought they held the power, drop a comment. Because that click, that silence afterward, that's the sound of self-respect reclaiming its space. And if you're still waiting for the courage to walk away from a lie, stay with me. Because the real story starts now. The apartment was still. Too still. After the door shut behind Lucas, I leaned against it, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for the entire evening. My legs threatened to give out. My palms were shaking. Not from fear, no, that had passed, but from the adrenaline of truth finally spoken. The kettle in the kitchen screamed into the silence. I walked toward it, turned it off, and stood there in the soft hum of the refrigerator, letting the heat of everything rise and settle. Lucas's phone calls came first, then the texts. I messed up. Please call me. It wasn't as bad as you think. They were just being protective. You're overreacting. You owe me a chance to explain. That last one stopped me cold. I owed him nothing. A week after the dinner, I blocked his number, deleted our photos from my phone, archived the texts not out of nostalgia, but as evidence for myself. A reminder of how far I'd gone and how blind I'd let myself become. I wasn't just angry, I was disappointed. In him, yes, but also in me. How could I, someone who spent years studying human interaction, someone fluent in culture and nuance and language, miss this? That's the thing about love, though. It's not blind, it's willfully blurry. We blur the edges of red flags, tell ourselves they're misunderstandings, call insults just teasing, excuse humiliation as just cultural difference. But eventually the blur fades, and you're left with a picture so sharp, it cuts. I called Zoe 2 days later. We met at our usual cafe, the one with the mismatched chairs and the murals of poetry on the walls. She was already sitting by the window with 2 lattes, one for me, just how I liked it. Oat milk, no sugar. You look like hell, she said as I sat down. Thanks, I mumbled with a crooked smile. I feel worse. I told her everything. From the moment I stepped into that house to the final slam of my front door. She didn't interrupt, just listened, brows furrowed, jaw tight, like she was chewing every word I spoke and swallowing it whole so I didn't have to digest it alone. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm so proud of you, she said softly. That took guts. It took too long, I replied. I should have seen it sooner. She shook her head. We all have blind spots when it comes to love. The important thing is, you saw the truth, and you didn't stay. We sat in silence, sipping coffee. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. And then, like a ghost from a forgotten room, her voice came back to me. Señora Ortega, my high school Spanish teacher. A woman barely over 5 feet tall, but with the intensity of a thunderstorm. She used to stand at the front of the classroom and say, "Language is power. When you learn another person's tongue, You don't just hear their words, you see who they are. You walk through the world they don't want you to see. I'd carried those words with me through college, through fieldwork in Guatemala, through this entire graduate program. But somehow with Lucas, I'd let go of them. I'd let him silence me in the one domain where I had complete mastery. Because love makes you quiet sometimes. But silence, I realize now, isn't the same as peace. That night I went home and pulled out my journal. I wrote everything. Not to relive it, but to document it. To capture the warnings I'd missed. The comments I'd laughed off. The shift from affection to possession. The first time I made myself smaller to make him feel taller. Not to punish myself, but to promise myself I'd never ignore my own discomfort again. If you've ever journaled a goodbye, not for closure, but for clarity, leave a comment. Because sometimes the act of writing it down is what finally sets you free. And if you've walked away from someone who mocked your brilliance while smiling to your face, hit subscribe because your voice is not too much. It's the exact amount of power they fear. 3 days after I wrote everything down, I received a message that stopped me mid-scroll. It was a direct message on Instagram, from Camilla. I nearly deleted it without opening, assuming it was some last-ditch effort to defend her brother or gaslight me into questioning what I'd heard. But curiosity outweighed caution. I tapped it open. I didn't know you understood. I'm sorry for laughing. What we did was cruel. That was it. A single message. Clean, vague. No real ownership, no true apology. Just a subtle shifting of the weight from her shoulders to mine. I stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply field. But I didn't respond. Because Camilla wasn't apologizing to me, she was apologizing for herself. She wanted relief, not reconciliation. And I didn't owe her absolution. Instead, I closed the app and opened a folder I hadn't touched in weeks, job applications. Before the dinner, I'd applied to dozens of places, nonprofits, global agencies, cultural consulting firms, and buried beneath old rejection emails, an automated thank you for applying responses, I saw something new. An offer. A bilingual copywriting agency in Seattle had reviewed my application and was extending a full-time position. Spanish fluency required. The job came with benefits, relocation support, and most importantly, a role that would allow me to use my voice every single day. I sat there stunned, rereading the email as if it might disappear. The timing felt cosmic. A week ago, I was nodding through dinner while people insulted me in the very language I now held as leverage. A language that had once been a secret tool was about to become my career. I whispered aloud to no one full circle. Later that night, I called my parents. They were overjoyed about the job, of course. But then Zoe must have told them about Lucas, because my dad's voice grew softer. Harper, he said, I know what happened with that guy wasn't easy. I just want you to know. I'm proud of you, not just for the job, for how you handled all of it. I groaned. Zoe should have kept that to herself. My mom jumped in. She was worried. And honestly, we're glad she told us. What you went through, most people would have stayed quiet, come home smiling, and gone back the next week like nothing happened. I don't feel strong, I admitted. I feel stupid. Recognizing when someone isn't treating you right and walking away from it, that's not weakness, my dad said. That's courage, and a lot of people never get there. After the call, I stood on my balcony, the city humming below me. I thought of Lucas's penthouse apartment, all cold marble and stainless steel. The way he had once touched the back of my neck during dinner, like he was silencing me with his palm. The way his family used language like a mirror, reflecting back only what they wanted me to see, shiny, shallow, false. I wasn't that girl anymore. I was the one who knew. And now I had a job that required every ounce of the skill I had spent years building. Now I would speak in 2 languages. I would write, connect, translate, and amplify. Not just for clients, but for the girl who once sat at a table full of wolves and smiled like she didn't bleed. If you've ever turned your wound into your weapon, leave a comment. And if you've ever found your power in the very thing someone mocked you for, don't scroll past. Subscribe. Because we're not just healing, we're reclaiming. One word at a time. The week I accepted the new job, I decided to clean house. Not just physically, though I did that too. I donated the sweater Lucas had once called quirky but cute, tossed the candle he brought back from Miami that gave me headaches, and deleted the last lingering photos of us from my hard drive. But more than that, I scrubbed the digital remnants of him from my life. Old texts, archived Instagram stories, a video I'd recorded at a dinner months ago where Lucas was mimicking a waiter's Eastern European accent. Back then, I had laughed along thinking it was harmless. Now I saw it differently. The video wasn't funny, it was cruel. A performance that thrived on belittlement. He had always been this way. I had just refused to see it. I deleted the video and with it the illusion I had clung to for far too long. To celebrate the new job and say goodbye to everything that wasn't serving me anymore, Zoe and I booked a trip to Costa Rica. Somewhere warm, somewhere vibrant, somewhere Lucas never wanted to go because it wasn't culturally rich enough. That alone made it perfect. We flew out on a Thursday and checked into a beachside guest house with colorful hammocks, ocean views, and no Wi-Fi strong enough to receive guilt texts from exes. Just how I liked it. The first few days we did everything I hadn't allowed myself to do in months. We hiked rainforest trails where howler monkeys screamed overhead. We bartered with local vendors for jewelry made of beach glass and seeds. We danced in open-air bars under strings of glowing lights, drinking passion fruit mojitos and laughing until our cheeks ached. And everywhere we went, I spoke Spanish. Not because I had something to prove, but because it felt like breathing again. I wasn't hiding it. I wasn't pretending not to understand. I wasn't filtering myself to fit anyone's fragile ego. I was fluent, and I wanted the world to know. One night after a long hike, Zoe and I wandered into a small beach cafe built from driftwood and lanterns. The sand was still warm beneath our feet. Locals and travelers gathered to watch the sun sink into the ocean, clapping as the sky turned molten orange. That's when he approached. "Mind if I join you?" he asked in English, tinged with an accent I couldn't quite place. He was tall, sun-kissed with a notebook tucked under his arm, and bare feet dusted in sand. Zoe kicked me gently under the table. "I'm Mateo," he said. "I own this place." I nodded. "Sure, have a seat." We talked for hours about nothing and everything. He was Costa Rican, but had lived in Australia for a few years. He loved poetry and surfboards in equal measure. When I mentioned I'd just started a new job using both English and Spanish, his eyes lit up. "You speak Spanish?" he asked, switching seamlessly. Fluently, I replied in kind. He smiled, slow and sure. "That's rare. Most tourists don't bother." "I believe in meeting people where they are," I told him. "Language is the first step." Zoe yawned and excused herself, mouthing something about not wanting to third wheel. I laughed. Mateo and I continued talking long after the stars came out. But this time, I wasn't searching for a new beginning. I wasn't looking for validation or distraction. I was simply present. We walked along the shore, the tide curling around our ankles. He asked me about my past. I told him only as much as I wanted to. There was power in that, too. At the edge of the beach, he stopped and said, "Can I ask something personal?" "Sure," I replied. "Has someone ever mocked you in a language they thought you didn't understand?" I blinked, stunned. Then I nodded slowly. "Yes, but they don't get to do that anymore." He looked at me not with pity, not with admiration, but with understanding. That, he said, takes strength. I smiled. Not the performative smile I used to give. A real one. If you've ever rediscovered yourself, after being made small, drop a comment. And if you've ever felt your voice come back like a tide steady, sure, and unstoppable, hit subscribe. Because healing isn't just quiet. Sometimes it's loud, proud, and spoken in every language you own. The morning after our walk with Mateo, I sat alone on the little patio outside our guest house, notebook on my lap pen, tapping against the rim of my coffee mug. The air smelled like salt and sugarcane. The ocean whispered in the background, its rhythm grounding me. I hadn't planned to write, but something in me wouldn't let the moment pass. I wrote the entire story down from the moment Lucas sat across from me in that cafe 6 months ago, to the second I closed the door behind him and locked it with the finality he never expected. I titled the piece, "Language and Love, What I Learned When My Boyfriend Didn't Know. I Understood His Insults." I submitted it to a digital publication. I followed nothing fancy, just a platform for stories by women about women. I didn't expect anyone to notice. I didn't submit it for revenge or attention. I submitted it to give the experience somewhere to go, somewhere it wouldn't rot inside me, somewhere it might do more than just hurt. It went viral within days. The comments flooded in. One woman wrote, "I left him yesterday. Your story gave me the strength to say enough." Another said he used to call me naive in Arabic, thinking I didn't know. I did. I just didn't have the courage you had until now. Dozens of messages like that. Women from every background, every age, writing about their own versions of what I'd lived through, in-laws who mocked their accents, partners who made jokes at their expense in front of family communities that turned silence into sport and gaslighting into culture. And in every comment, I saw a reflection of the girl I had been, the one who smiled through slights, who nodded through cruelty, who gave grace to people who saw her as a punchline. I realized then my story wasn't unique. It was common, tragically so. But telling it, naming it, gave it weight. And that weight shifted something, not just in me, but in others. It created a center of gravity, a place to say this happened. It was real, and I am not crazy for feeling hurt. A week later, I got an email from the editor of the site. She thanked me for the submission. She said it had reached over 200,000 readers in 3 days. She asked if I'd consider writing more, maybe even a series about power communication and reclaiming voice. I said yes, because I had more to say. The piece had turned into something I never expected, a conversation. One I wasn't just having with strangers on the internet, but with myself. Back at home, as I settled into my new job, I started seeing myself in a different light. I no longer questioned whether I was too sensitive or too direct. I stopped translating my needs into palatable versions. I stopped softening the edges of what I wanted. One day, while preparing lesson plans for the beginner Spanish class I had volunteered to teach at the community center, I found myself writing a question on the whiteboard. Why do you want to learn another language? That night, I posed the same question to my students, mostly middle school girls, some of them shy, some bold beyond their years. One said, my mom says it'll help me get a better job someday. Another said, I want to understand the lyrics to Bad Bunny songs. But then a quiet girl in the back raised her hand and said, I want to talk to everyone in the world. That one stayed with me. 'Cause that's what language really is. Not just a tool, not just a skill. It's a bridge. And sometimes it's a weapon we turn inward. But now I was learning how to use mine for connection again, not protection. If you've ever told your story not to get sympathy, but to create a doorway for someone else, leave a comment. And if you know what it feels like to finally use your voice not as defense, but as a declaration, subscribe. Because your words can build bridges others never thought they could cross. 2 weeks after returning from Costa Rica, I found myself in a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the job, though I loved it, or the classes I was teaching. It was the space I'd created around myself, intentional, peaceful, real. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt whole. Zoe and I grabbed dinner at our favorite Thai place one Friday night, and halfway through my green curry, she looked at me and said, I don't think I've ever seen you this grounded. I smiled. It's wild, isn't it? I thought I'd be a wreck after him. But I'm not. I'm clearer. You let it break you open, she said, but you didn't let it bury you. We clinked glasses. That weekend, I started organizing old photos on my laptop, travel shots, moments from grad school, snapshots of the person I was before Lucas. Buried in a folder labeled Backups, I found a short video clip I had forgotten entirely. It was from early in our relationship. Lucas, slightly tipsy, at a rooftop party hosted by one of his friends. He had his arm draped around my shoulders, his voice louder than usual, and in front of everyone he grinned at the camera and said, Here she is, my American trophy. Smart enough to brag about, sweet enough to not talk back. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But now watching it, I didn't feel amused. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The clip lasted only 20 seconds, but it told me everything I had refused to acknowledge in real time. He had never seen me as an equal. He saw me as a convenient archetype. Blonde, American, soft-spoken. Someone who made him look better by comparison. Someone he could mold or mute. And I let him, not because I was weak, but because I wanted to believe the version of love he sold me. That clip was the last thread. I deleted it. Not in anger, not in grief, but in liberation. It was like taking out the last piece of trash from a house I no longer lived in. That evening, I walked to a salsa class held at a community rec center a few blocks from my apartment. I didn't know anyone there. I didn't go with a date. I wasn't trying to meet someone. I just wanted to dance. The music was loud, joyful. The instructor called out steps with energy, and I stumbled more than once, laughing at myself. My cheeks flushed, not from embarrassment, but from movement, from freedom. No one was watching me to judge. No one was mocking me in a corner language. I was just there, barefoot on polished wood, learning the rhythm of my own body again. It reminded me that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the small reclaimings. A deleted video, a spontaneous dance, a full breath taken in a room where no one's controlling the air. On my walk home, shoes and hand hair messy from sweat and joy, I felt light. Not because everything had been fixed, but because nothing was being hidden anymore. I was done apologizing for taking up space, for being smart and intuitive and blunt and fluent. I passed a little bookstore on the corner, the same one I used to frequent before I met Lucas. I stopped, walked in, and bought myself a hardcover journal. The cover read, "Tell your story before someone else does." That night I wrote this sentence across the first page. I will never again mute myself to make someone else feel louder. If you've ever rediscovered joy in your own rhythm, drop a comment. And if you've ever looked at the version of yourself you left behind and whispered, "Thank you for surviving that," don't forget to subscribe. Because every small act of reclaiming is a revolution, and yours has already begun. 3 months after that dinner, the one where they laughed, where I listened, where I never raised my voice but made sure every word stuck, I received an invitation that felt like a quiet reward from the universe. Not from Lucas. God, no. He'd stopped trying weeks ago. It was from the publication that had first picked up my story. They wanted me to speak on a panel language as liberation: how women reclaim power through voice. I almost said no. I didn't think I was ready. But that's the thing about growth. It's rarely comfortable, but always necessary. So I said yes. The panel took place at a small but packed auditorium in New York City. 4 of us sat in high stools on a softly lit stage. A poet who had written about her experience as an immigrant child navigating 2 languages, a professor of sociolinguistics, a journalist who had exposed corruption in her home country, and me. I felt small at first. Who was I compared to these women? But when it was my turn to speak, I looked out at the audience and saw a sea of faces, all colors, all ages, all waiting to hear something real. So I told them my story, about the boy who quoted Neruda but couldn't speak kindness, about the dinner that started like a gift and unraveled into humiliation, about the language I loved and how I had almost let someone use it to silence me. And then I said this: the first time someone underestimates you in a language they think you don't understand, it feels like betrayal. But the second time, it feels like opportunity, because now you know the truth, and now you can choose how to respond. The room was silent, not from disinterest, but from impact. Afterward, during the Q&A, a young woman stood up and said, "How do you know when it's time to speak and when it's more powerful to stay silent?" I thought for a moment before replying. You'll feel it. It's the moment your silence isn't about fear, it's about control. It's when your restraint is no longer weakness, but intention. But don't let silence become a habit. Eventually, you have to speak. You have to say, "This is what happened, and I was there, and I am not ashamed to tell it." There was applause, but I didn't need it, because inside I felt calm, anchored. Later that night, I walked through the city alone. I passed couples, laughing friends, drinking wine on balconies, a street musician playing something soft and nostalgic on a violin. I thought about Lucas, not with longing, but with a sort of detachment I hadn't known I was capable of. I didn't want to erase what happened. I just didn't want it to own me anymore. At a red light, my phone buzzed. A message from Zoe: just watched the panel online. You were incredible. So proud of you. I smiled, texting back, couldn't have done any of it without you. Because Zoe was the one who saw the cracks first, who called out the discomfort I'd rationalized, who reminded me that real friendship doesn't flatter, it warns. And standing there on that New York sidewalk, I realized something else. I wasn't fluent in Spanish. I wasn't fluent in healing. I was fluent in myself. And that was a language no one could ever take from me again. If you've ever looked back and seen your pain not as a weight, but as a foundation, leave a comment. And if you've used your voice to build something beautiful from the ruins, subscribe. Because your story matters. And telling it may just save someone else. The last morning of summer, I sat at my desk in my new apartment, a cozy third-floor walk-up with uneven hardwood floors and sun that flooded in through the cracked blinds, and opened a letter that had been buried under a pile of magazines for weeks. It was from the community center where I'd been teaching beginner Spanish classes. Inside was a handwritten note from one of my students, a girl named Sarai. She'd written, "Thank you for helping me find my voice in 2 languages. Now I feel brave at school, like I can talk to anyone." I stared at the card for a long time, my fingers brushing over the uneven cursive. Brave. That's what this entire journey had been about. Not fluency, not exposure, not revenge. Bravery. The kind that grows in silence. The kind that walks away from people who don't clap when you speak. The kind that chooses dignity over comfort every time. I folded the note, slid it into a drawer with others, like it little reminders that pain when processed becomes purpose. That afternoon I had coffee with my mentor, Professor Delaney. She had been one of the few people who encouraged me to pursue language not just as a tool, but as a bridge, a weapon, a mirror. She asked how the job was going. I told her I loved it. "I feel like I'm finally writing from a place that's mine," I said. "Not borrowed?" not staged, just mine. She nodded thoughtfully. You've always had that voice. It just needed something to shake it loose. I thought about that long ride home from Lucas's family dinner. How I'd stared out the window counting every time someone in that house had made me small, every time I'd smiled through it. How I'd started that night with a dress I bought to be accepted and ended it with a voice I reclaimed to be free. I'm glad it shook, I said. Professor Delaney smiled. Sometimes it takes being spoken about like you're not in the room to realize exactly who you are. Later that evening, I packed a small overnight bag and headed to the train station. Mateo, yes, the cafe owner from Costa Rica, had emailed me the week before. He was visiting New York for a coffee conference. Would love to see you, the email said, simple and sincere. We met at a small cafe in Brooklyn. Nothing fancy. Mismatched chairs, a barista with tattoos reading Neruda verses. I didn't dress up. I didn't rehearse answers. I didn't shrink. Mateo greeted me with a quiet smile and said, still fluent. In every way that matters, I replied. We walked the streets for hours, talked about coffee and culture mistakes and healing what it means to listen and be listened to. There was no flirtation, no expectations, just connection. And it felt like coming full circle, because 3 months ago, I was nodding through a dinner where I was the joke. Now I was here on my terms, in my language, in my voice. Before we parted ways, Mateo said, you look lighter. I smiled. I left a few things behind. We hugged, and as I walked toward the subway, I realized I hadn't thought about Lucas in weeks. Not in anger, not in sorrow, just nothing. That was freedom. If you've ever made it to the other side of betrayal and found peace where rage once lived, leave a comment. And if you've stopped needing closure from people who couldn't give you truth in the first place, subscribe. Because you don't need their apology. You just need your own voice and the courage to use it. There's a moment quiet ordinary when you realize you've survived something you thought might break you. It doesn't come with fanfare. No music swells, no dramatic revelation. Just you, standing in your own space, breathing deeply, and not flinching anymore. That's what happened to me. One morning I woke up, made coffee, opened my laptop to write, and realized I was no longer writing from pain. I was writing from clarity. The pain taught me things, yes, but it didn't get to stay. Now I write to remind other women, you are not too much. You are not too sensitive. You are not a joke told in a language you weren't supposed to understand. You are a force, a mirror they didn't expect, a story they can't rewrite. So tell your truth. Say the words they thought you'd never say. And when you do say them in every language you know, because when you're fluent in yourself, in your boundaries, in your worth, no one can ever misinterpret your silence again. This isn't just a story about understanding another language. It's about understanding yourself and never letting anyone translate you into something smaller again. If that resonates with you, subscribe, leave your story below, and let's build a world where women don't just listen, we speak.